How's this? Cool. Hey, thanks everyone for showing up. I see this is a full room, which suggests to me that perhaps Marvel might be a little bit popular. I was getting a little concerned after the Spider-Verse movie. I had only seen like a dozen or so Spider-Man cosplayers running around and like, oh, those are rookie numbers. We got to get them up. But I'm impressed by the turnout here. So it's not just here that Marvel is super popular. Actually, on my last trip to Japan, I had to make an emergency run for clothing, and I was like, "Oh, I'll go buy some anime T-shirts." And then I went to department stores, and I just kept finding Marvel clothes everywhere, more than anime clothes. And I was like, "Huh, this shows how much of a pop culture juggernaut this brand has become internationally, and especially in Japan. It's something that is kind of ubiquitous, and it's starting to seep into our Japanese cartoons, believe it or not. You start to see cases where character designs are kind of lifted from Marvel things, or they make little in-jokes, and you start to go to doujinshi shops and you see Marvel-based doujinshi, and then even when you go see anime movies in the theater, sometimes they do these weird cross-promotions where they take the posters from Marvel movies and they redo them with whatever franchise they're trying to promote. But this isn't the only way that it works, because anime is starting to sneak into our Marvel comics. So I thought this would be a fun topic to kind of deep dive into for this panel. So today we're going to go over some of the Marvel's adaptations of Japanese properties and the way that manga has changed Marvel comics over the years, and then also look at some of the Marvel characters that have crossed the seas to Japan and have their own unique spin over there or have been made by Japanese artists. So just quickly putting this out here, whenever I do a panel, I invariably wind up with way too much content and I have to start cutting things. And so just for the sake of brevity, we're going to try to skip some stuff. No slights against anybody, but if there's something that you're like, oh, that guy forgot something, please reach out to me and let me know. So just as a quick history lesson, spoilers, yes. Uh, So yeah, as a quick history lesson, Marvel started out in 1939, but they were called Timely at the time, and they didn't really change their branding to Marvel as we know it until 1961, and that's the same time that they started reconstructing as mostly a superhero company. But that worked out quite well for them, as their comics were kind of seen as an edgier version of what the competitors had to offer. And it was very similar to what was going on with the Gekiga movement in Japan. You had Gekiga comics like Golgo 13 that were popular on college campuses. Same deal with Marvel. It was like, oh, this is more mature reading than the other competitors' stuff. So because of that, there started to be some interest in Japan of what's going on with comics overseas, and there was actually a journal by Osamu Tezuka. He published this magazine, Calm, and one of the reporters, Kosei Ono, just basically started reporting in 1968 on Marvel comics, and that was kind of the first exposure that a lot of Japanese people had to it, although they didn't have the comics themselves, they just had reporting on it. But it was very quickly after that that the first incarnations of Marvel started appearing in Japan. After a couple of attempts to break into the market, Stan Lee basically hired this guy, Gene Pelk, and he said, you're going to be our man in Japan. And he went over and started making deals with Japanese companies, a lot of deals with Toei, to kind of license Marvel characters in Japan, and then got a whole bunch of licenses for Japanese stuff to bring over to the US. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. So for our first part, let's talk about some of the Japanese stuff that Marvel has done over the years. So I think you can't really talk about Japanese pop culture without talking about the big G, Godzilla. This had a 24-issue series from Marvel that took place in the Marvel universe. So Godzilla shows up and he fights against the champions and the Avengers and all of kind of Marvel characters that you'd expect as he treks across America. Toho, the company that owns Godzilla, was very restrictive. So they said, oh, you can get the rights to Godzilla, but you can't have the rights to any of our other monsters. So that's part of the reason why it makes more sense to put Godzilla in the Marvel Universe rather than come up with a whole new roster of characters for an original story. One of the fun facts about this is if you buy anything with Godzilla on it, it has a little trademark with the Godzilla icon, and that actually comes from the Marvel comic. It's under the 40-cent sticker there. That's the official Godzilla logo and has been for almost half a century now. So eventually, Marvel lost the license, so they couldn't use Godzilla anymore. But that didn't stop them from using Godzilla anymore. So they start doing all of these like plausibly deniable things, like, you know, here Godzilla shows up in the Iron Man comics and Dr. Demonicus doesn't refer to him by name. He's just like, my old enemy, you look different now. And you're like, huh. And then there were a couple of times when Marvel artists got a little bit too ambitious with their Godzilla usage, and for reprints they actually had to go back and change the art so that they would not get sued. So another case, a similar staff in terms of the writers and artists for the Godzilla comics is Shogun Warriors. And Shogun Warriors were a series of toys in the U.S. that were basically licensed from Japanese super robots. And the line actually had Godzilla in it, but it also had Mazinger and Getter-Robo and things like that. And Marvel was tasked to making a Shogun Warriors comic book. So they selected 3 of the characters, Raiden, Dangard Ace, and Combattler V, and they didn't know any of the stories from the anime because that anime was not widely available. So they just kind of made up their own stories, made up their own pilots, and it was fine. This also took place in the Marvel Universe, but the robots are officially destroyed off screen in the Fantastic Four issue because they lost the license. Now a fun fact about this, issue 18 has a villain robot named Megatron. Marvel hung on to that name because a few years later, they got a bunch more toys from Japan, and they needed to come up with a new story to sell these toys to American children. So this is, in fact, the very first Transformers anything, because they took these Japanese toys and they came up with a storyline. And very shortly thereafter, there was the TV series, which was also produced by Marvel Entertainment, which was adjacent, but the Transformers also take place in the Marvel Universe. So Marvel characters show up, and every once in a while, characters from the Transformers comics still show up in Marvel things. This is a confusing one because there's different brands that go in the US versions of the comics versus the UK versions of the comics, and then the storylines from these comics were continued by a different publisher, IDW, and Transformers is really complicated, and we could like have many panels by people more qualified than myself to talk about Transformers all day long. So let's just move on from this. Another toy line is MICRONAUTS. This is based on the Microman toy series, which is actually kind of tied in with the origins of Transformers in terms of the Transformers are based on Diaclone, which were related to Microman. So this is a series about people that shrink and go into what's called the microverse. And the funny thing with this is these comics continued long after the toys were no longer on sale. So they were kind of very popular, and it was one of the first comics that was distributed directly to comic book shops. You know, before comic book shops were a big deal, you just go to the grocery store and buy comics there. But this was directly to the comic book shops, so you knew that the real hardcore nerds were all about their Micronauts. And this actually has ramifications later for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And if you've seen Quantumania, you know there's this thing, the quantum realm, and a lot of characters that are very similar to the Micronauts characters show up in Quantumania, but they can't use any of the ones that were part of that license, and it's all very complicated there. Okay, one more thing based on Japanese toys, I promise. Zoids. Zoids are a series of model kits that are all animal based, and they are kind of like robots that you put together and they walk around and they have little pilots. And Zoids has been adapted numerous times into numerous forms of media, and none of them have anything to do with each other because people just see the toys and they make up their own stories, and I think that's what you're supposed to do as a kid anyway. But this is actually a neat one because if you're a comics person, you know the name Grant Morrison. Like I think his most famous work is All-Star Superman, but he got one of his first writing gigs working for Zoids in the UK, and you know there's a whole different comic scene over there than there is in the US because of different historical factors that had to do with like they had to have a certain percentage of stuff that was originally made in the UK in order to be published and so on and so forth. Moving along into the 1990s, we get a whole bunch of comics from Saban. So this is the company that made Power Rangers and Masked Rider and VR Troopers, and all of those got made into Marvel Comics. And they are very cheaply, very quickly produced comics, and if you've seen those shows, you understand why. I think that this is actually a great kind of full circle moment, though, because if you look at the history of these things, let's just walk through here. You first had the Marvel superhero Captain America, who was this symbol of his country, and that was licensed to Toei in Japan. And they said, okay, well, let's do something with this concept. Let's have Captain Japan and like a Captain America and like a Captain Kenya and a Captain France and a Captain Cossack, and have them be a team together. And that really kicks off what we call the Super Sentai series. And Marvel actually co-produced this for 3 years in Japan, over 3 series. They were technically Marvel co-productions, and Marvel, was considering bringing one of those series, Sun Vulcan, to the U.S. And they said, well, we'll just take the Japanese special effects footage, cut out the Japanese actors, film it with new American actors, and then that never happened. But somebody else, Saban, picks up the idea with a Super Sentai series many years down the road, Zyuranger, and does that, and that's where we get Power Rangers from. So it all comes back to Marvel at the end. So while we're talking about iconic Japanese superheroes, we got to talk about Ultraman. This is one that's been kind of in a rights limbo for decades now due to a court battle, but they recently were able to clear that up and immediately license the character to Marvel. So you've got these new Ultraman Marvel comics that are coming out right now. They're still hitting the stands, and these are all they take place in their own continuity, so it's a fresh take for American audiences. So if you don't know the Ultraman lore, you can go in fresh, but if you know the Ultraman lore, you can be like, I get all the Easter eggs, and they're fun, but they are doing an Avengers crossover also, so they're really kind of cross-promoting it. But even though these are the first Ultraman comics, if you know the character Ultraman, he's this giant who fights Godzillas, basically. The monsters from Ultraman don't make their debut in the Marvel comics for Ultraman. They actually were decades before in the Ultraman comics. In the Marvel comics, they appeared in Fantastic Four and Warlock. Because basically what happened was Marvel had the rights to Godzilla's Gang. Godzilla's Gang was a toy line licensed from Japan. When they licensed those, they licensed the likeness to multiple Ultraman monsters. So Marvel had the rights to these monsters, they just put them in their comic books. So I said we weren't going to talk about toys anymore, and then we wound up talking about toys. Speaking of giant monsters crossing over into Marvel, recently, and by recently I mean 10 years ago, this was actually first published in Japan, but it's been published over here multiple times since. It's just a short story where the Avengers fight various Titans from Attack on Titan, and it's absolutely delightful. So if you get the Attack on Titan Colossal Edition, you can read it, and it's good stuff. Another character that shows up in crossovers similarly to this. There's a short story where Muda from Space Brothers goes up and he's on the moon, and then Iron Man shows up and he's like, "What? Why is there another guy up here?" So that is gonna wrap up that segment. But let's talk about some of the influences outside of just licensing characters that Marvel has had put upon it from Japanese content. So if you kind of look at the early input, there's a lot of kind of stereotypes and like, oh, if somebody's Japanese, they're probably a ninja, and like you just have to kind of roll your eyes and go with it. But that's kind of the early way that characters were depicted if they were Japanese. And then later on, we start to see things get broader as anime and manga become more popular. You start to see a change in the types of media that you see depicted as, quote, Japanese, end quote, in Marvel content. So in the 2000s, you have this Marvel Tsunami imprint. And if you look at American comics, they're usually, yay big. And they start printing them, yay big, because that's the way that Japanese comics were. And they saw that these Japanese comics are flying off the shelf in bookstores across America. So they're like, okay, let's get these smaller books. And then they start, because you have a smaller book size, you're going to not want to have as much dialogue on the page. So the storytelling starts to get really decompressed. So you start having things that are written for the books as opposed to written for individual issues. And then the art style also just kind of picks up and starts to become very manga inspired. And you can see some examples here of Marvel comics from the 2000s that are really like, hey, this is what the kids are into, this manga stuff. And a big part of this is due to Marvel's current editor-in-chief, C.B. Cebulski. He actually cut his teeth in manga. He started out as an editor at CPM in the 90s. And he was an editor, and he worked on all sorts of manga over there. But then he also wanted to write stuff on the side when he got a job at Marvel. So he came up with a pen name for himself, Akira Yoshida. So he was posing as a Japanese person writing these comic books for other companies, and then a person at Marvel kind of like scouted him and said, hey, that's Akira Yoshida guy, we should hire him. And yeah, wound up working basically two hats at Marvel, one under this Japanese pseudonym and one under his real name. But because of all of his connections from working in the manga world, he was able to pull in all of these Japanese artists and really get them to work on things at Marvel. And then also because of his interest and kind of understanding of the popularity, he started pushing for projects at Marvel that were very kind of Japanese influenced. So I think the most infamous version of this is the Marvel MANGAVERSE from the 2000s, and this basically had begun in 2000, and it was kind of brought to life by Ben Dunn, who's the guy behind Ninja High School. And if you know Ninja High School, you know it's just a nonstop barrage of tropes that you know from anime and manga. And this is very much in that mold. So it's like, yeah, Wolverine's a cyborg, but now he has laser claws. Or, what if Iron Man was a Gundam, and then you have Spider-Man as a ninja. By the way, because Spider-Verse is out and people like it, I decided to include a Spider-Man counter. So anytime Spider-Man shows up, you can count your Spider-Man variants. I didn't mention that before. So one thing that's notable about these is that there really wasn't a whole lot of Japanese involvement. It was just kind of Western comics makers kind of, thinking, oh, well, we can kind of ape this and, take from that what you will. But later projects had a lot more actual Japanese involvement. Another example that is of more Japanese involvement, there was a short anthology, Marvel Eye. And basically, when Marvel first started out, they had a lot more romance comics, but then the Comics Code came about in the 1950s, and they said, taboo subjects are forbidden. But Marvel eventually abandoned the Comics Code, and as a result, they decided to lean more into some romance comics. Also because romance comics sell really big in manga, and they wanted to lean into that manga market. So this anthology is 3 romance stories featuring different couples in the Marvel universe, and it's drawn by shoujo artists, and it's really interesting to look at because you look at this page here and you can imagine what it would look like in a black and white shoujo manga, but it's been colorized, so it's this weird, like, this is kind of manga and kind of not. Another quick mention of something that's Japanese inspired is this one story in Spider-Man Fairy Tales. This was kind of an anthology series where it was reimagining Spider-Man in different contexts. This will be important later. And one of them was, kind of a period piece set in Japan with different yokai. So, traditional Japanese spirits. So this version of Spider-Man, Izumi, is a demon slayer, and then the Vulture is like a Tengu. So this kind of set the stage for what eventually became Spider-Verse in terms of the thematics of like different imaginary Spider-Man stories. And speaking of Spider-Verse, everybody loves Penny Parker, introduced in the Spider-Verse comics. What's interesting is this character starts off very, very Evangelion inspired, and actually, if you look in one of the stories, you can see the cast of Evangelion chilling out behind her there. But then you know they do a movie version, and she's like much happier and brighter, and you know in the new movie she's a little bit more somber, but not as much as in the comics. So you're like, okay, these are two different versions of Penny Parker and SPDR. So is there like a whole SPDR universe, multiverse thing? And like, yes, there is. There's a whole lot of incarnations of this character, and my favorite is one of them is actually a magical girl. Couple more examples of stuff that's very Japanese inspired. There was a recent comic series called Tekon Avengers, and this was also made to sell toys. But this has basically armored versions of the various Marvel characters, and they were designed by Eiichi Shimizu, who does the Ultraman series on Netflix and the manga that's based on, and Kenshi Ando, who designed the armors for Tiger and Bunny. And we can talk about a whole lot of other little examples here and there, but I figured that would take a long time. The elephant in the room, I think, when talking about Marvel influenced by Japanese stuff, is Big Hero 6. This team shows up in the 90s for the first time, and they're actually intended as characters for Alpha Flight. Alpha Flight is a team of Canadian superheroes, so the idea is that they're all Canadian. So of course there would also be a team who are all Japanese. And if you have a team that's all Japanese, they have to have like a samurai and a kaiju and a magical girl, because that's the way that works. So Big Hero 6 had like a couple of appearances in different miniseries and stuff like that, but they weren't very much a big deal until Disney decides they're going to make a Big Hero 6 movie. And what's interesting then is after that, Marvel stops publishing Big Hero 6 comics entirely, and they even they think of it as more of a Disney series now. IDW had a Big Hero 6 comic that's based on the movie, and you think, why are they publishing it in non-Marvel? And similarly, there's actually been manga published in Japan based on the movie version of Big Hero 6. So that's a perfect segue to talk about manga and anime based on Marvel properties. Here's kind of the first example I can think of, even though this is non-official. This is from a Shonen King issue in 1967, and the caption is just "Concrete Man." And this is very clearly the thing from Fantastic Four. But back in 1967, as we said, there were no Marvel comics in Japan, and you could just get away with printing whatever. The first Marvel comic that was printed in Japan was Ryoichi Ikegame's Spider-Man. So this is the artist that did like Crying Freeman. You can see he's crying, so it makes sense. And this was really an attempt by Shonen Magazine to spice things up, and they're like, hey, let's do something based on a Western comic book. So the editor there reached out to Kosei Ono, who we mentioned before, who was doing those magazine articles on American comic books, and said, hey, what's the best comic book that we should make a manga adaptation in our magazine? And he said Spider-Man. So he wound up writing a whole bunch of it, and uncredited, unfortunately. And then later, Kazumasa Hirai of Wolf Guy fame came in and wrote a lot of it. But it's generally called Ikegame's Spider-Man because he's the guy who wrote it the whole time. And some of this has been published in English, and some of it has not. And that's because it's really dark, and there's a lot of violence and a lot of stuff that at the time in America would not fly in comic books. There's a storyline where Spider-Man gets accused of rape, so it's really intense in places. And Stan Lee apparently read this and he was like, "Well, this is good, but this is not my Spider-Man." So, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a few years after this, Spider-Man's girlfriend has a fall off a bridge, and it gets dark over in America also. But yeah, fans of this actually call it "Suffering Man" because it's no good for our main character Yu Komori. This is not the only Japanese Spider-Man of the '70s. Here we get to the Toei series. So this is the first thing that Gene Pell helped collaborate on at Toei. So basically, this was originally planned as like an isekai story where it's set like 2,000 years in the past about like the birth of Japan, and Spider-Man would just be like sucked from the present day and show up as like a character in ancient times. And I guess that was too weird, but they still went pretty weird with it because this incarnation of Spider-Man is he doesn't get a bite from a radioactive spider. He gets a blood transfusion from an alien from the planet Spider, and he winds up fighting a bunch of monsters of the week that are sent down by this evil organization. It's very similar to what Kamen Rider had kind of set the mold for in Japan and Japanese pop culture. And it's such a weird show that most of the Marvel staff, when it was first shown, anecdotally, they were like, "What is this? We don't understand." And then there was one person in the room that was really enthused. It was Stan Lee. He's like, allegedly said, "Now this is comic books," and as a result, this went on for 41 episodes and is still beloved by a cult fan base to this day. And I can't mention this because people had to ask about it without bringing up Leopardon. So this Spider-Man, he has a spaceship because of course he does, the Marveler, and it will transform into this giant robot Leopardon. And you think, well, this is an odd thing to have in a Japanese Spider-Man, but basically what happened was that the toy company was like, "Hey, we need to have a giant robot in the show," and Toei was like, "Okay." So, but funny thing, this toy was actually, it was sold in the U.S. as part of the Shogun Warriors line, but they don't advertise that it's from Spider-Man, and like this robot never shows up in the Shogun Warriors comic book, which is such a lost opportunity, if you ask me. There's actually a rumor out there that the suit was stolen, and that's why they relied on stock footage for a lot of it. I found no like evidence that this is true. It's a fun story, but I don't think that it's actually the case. But just in case you come across that. Now this has actually been getting a whole lot of recent press because this version of Spider-Man has started being marketed very heavily after the positive reception that they've had to seeing it in the Spider-Verse. And as a result, you've gotten like original Toei Spider-Man comic stories and Nendoroids and Funko Pops and Marvel Legends figures and Hot Wheels and all of this other stuff. My question is, where's the Blu-ray set? This show was briefly streaming on Marvel.com, all with English subtitles, and it is not even on Disney Plus anymore. They had a documentary about it on Disney Plus. But that documentary got taken down, so I'm just like, come on, guys, make this happen, get that out there. Now Spider-Man was quite popular in Japan, and as a result of that, you start to see a bunch of imitators. So the very first monster that Kamen Rider fights is actually Kumo Otoko, which if you translate Kumo is spider and Otoko is man, you might figure out what it's referencing. Similarly, there's the devil spider in Aztec Kaiser, which is totally legally distinct, and then this mysterious unnamed figure that shows up in Kinnikuman. So they were playing fast and loose with likenesses, and another example of something that did that is the game Super Shinobi, where Spider-Man and Batman and Godzilla and Jackie Chan, Rambo, Terminator, a whole bunch of characters show up as enemy bosses. But eventually what happened was Sega licensed Spider-Man to include in this game. So this is officially a Japanese Spider-Man project now, even though it started out without that license. Now let's get into a handful of the Spider-Man manga, and we're not going to only talk about Spider-Man, but Spider-Man's the best. Let's face it. So Spider-Man J is available in English from Marvel, and this is basically a comic very similar in that Japanese superhero mindset of, okay, he's fighting an evil organization that sends one monster per week, and then he has to battle them. This is a funny case because in Japanese the main character is named Kakeru Amano, but they changed it to Peter Parker for the English translation. More recently, we've been getting more and more Marvel content, I think because the movies have been so popular. So another one that's available in English, this is available from Viz, is Fake Red. And this is, basically set in like a Marvel-ish universe. That it's about a kid who finds a Spider-Man costume and figures out that if he puts on a Spider-Man costume, people will pay attention to him. And unfortunately, it's for the better and for the worse, because people might be like, hey, Spider-Man, have a free soda or whatever, and then like also people are like, hey, Spider-Man, my building's on fire, can you like help? So he winds up kind of being negged into becoming an actual superhero just by nature of having a Spider-Man costume. This is a short one, Spider-Man Kizuna. This is about another Japanese transfer student who encounters the ghost of Spider-Man. Spider-Man's been killed, but according to Shaman King rules, he can put the ghost into his body and then do the things that guy does. So he forms this new superhero, Spider-Man Kizuna. And body swapping doesn't end there, because there's also a series with Dr. Octopus. And actually, there's been a lot of body swapping with Dr. Octopus in the comics, if you follow that. But this is from the My Hero Academia Vigilantes artist, and this is about Dr. Octopus going into a coma, and then he isekais into a middle school girl. And then just recently announced, Polygon Pictures is going to be doing a series for Disney Plus, and they say that it'll be produced with digital animation, and if you've seen Polygon Pictures using the latest CGI technology, you might have an idea of what to expect there. But I'm hoping for good things. I have my doubts based on their previous output animation wise, but maybe they'll have a good writer team. There's not a whole lot that's known about this anime quite yet. So let's put Spidey on the back burner for a little bit anyway, and talk about some other superheroes that have had Japanese involvement. The first is Kazuo Koike is the Hulk. So, we mentioned Ryoichi Ikegami, who did the art for Crying Freeman. Kazuo Koike wrote Crying Freeman, so of course Hulk is also crying. From what I understand, this comic has not been reprinted, but this Hulk, it's more of his just any negative emotions that gives him his power. So in fact, yes, making him cry would really go for it. Another comic that hasn't been reprinted is the Moon Knight manga. Japan actually has a history of moon-themed superheroes, so it makes sense that Toei wanted to do a Moon Knight show at some point. And this got canceled, but they went ahead with a manga anyways as a manga tie-in. And this is by Gosaku Oda, who's one of kind of Go Nagai's accolades, and he basically changed the entire story. So in this, the Moon Knight is like a survivor of a ninja clan, and he's invincible while he's under moonlight. So really, it's kind of more like Wolf Guy than it is like Moon Knight, but whatever. That wasn't the only lost project at Toei in the 1970s. They also had plans for a 3D Man, and most interestingly, they wanted to do a Silver Surfer series. And the idea with this was it was going to be Silver Surfer and Carol Danvers, who's like Captain Marvel now, but she would have been Miss Marvel at the time, and Ben Grimm the Thing. They would be a team. These characters have nothing to do with each other, but I guess they're all outer space themed. And the enemy Galactus would be sending down one monster per week for them to fight, of course. So this got axed, but a lot of people said, like, hey, very shortly after this, Marvel introduces this character who's silver, who rides around on this thing that looks like a surfboard, Space Sheriff Gavan. So if you go to the discotheque booth, you ask them about Space Sheriff Gavan. But there's that question, it's not been confirmed, but like, has there been any cross-influence between these? And it's interesting to think about. But that wasn't the end at Toei, because they produced two animated movies based on Marvel Comics. A lot of people don't know that these are based on Marvel Comics, but one of them is Dracula, Sovereign of the Damned, based on Tomb of Dracula, and the other is The Monster of Frankenstein. And everybody brings up, yes, that's the thing where Dracula eats a hamburger, and yes, that's the thing that happens. But that's not the weirdest thing in the movie. Like, Dracula has a half-human son who turns into a bird, and nobody brings that up. It's always a hamburger. So this has been remastered recently, so there's a gorgeous version on YouTube. So if you want to check it out, check that out. Monster Frankenstein, I was a little disappointed by. Like, it's violent, as you would expect from Toei, but it's not as totally weird, coming out of that mold. We're talking about vampires and horror. There is a manga based on Blade. This is from the Afro Samurai artist, Takashi Okazaki. And this was only included in the soundtrack for Blade Trinity. The RZA actually shows up as a character in this comic, so that's a very interesting thing to include in a soundtrack. Another manga that's actually several manga. X-Men the animated series was huge in Japan in the 90s, and has been adapted into a light novel and then 2 different manga, one of which has a whole bunch of different artists that worked on it. The artist that I think the most people might know in this is Miyako Kojima. She just had a horror manga anthology come out. But it must have been a really interesting project working on this, because like one artist would do one manga, and then another artist would do the next chapter, and another artist would do the next chapter. About half of these were actually printed in English, but they didn't get through the entire run. While we're talking about X-Men the Animated Series, anyone who has not seen the Japanese openings for X-Men the Animated Series, do yourself a favor when you get home. Pull up YouTube, look for the Japanese X-Men openings, because they are incredible. Basically, they have these hardcore rock songs, which are, by the way, on Spotify if you get really hooked on them. And just over-the-top animation as they really try to sell it to a Japanese audience. Whereas, the American X-Men opening is great, but it's a little bit stoic, and these are really dynamic as this rock band tells you to cry for the moon and stuff like that. So a member of the X-Men is Wolverine. So there's been a couple of different things involving this Wolverine dude. There was a light novel. This is actually a very light novel, in that it's mostly pictures by Greg Rucka and Yoshitaka Amano. Amano is the Vampire Hunter D Final Fantasy guy, and he basically got commissioned to do illustrations for this piece, and it's actually part of the Marvel overall Gestalt canon. So they'll reference back to stuff that happened in this comic, Electra and Wolverine the Redeemer. Another Wolverine story that fans tend to think is one of the best Wolverine solo books that's ever been printed is SNIKT. That's the sound that his claws make when they come out. And this is by Tsutomu Nihei of Blam and Knights of Sidonia fame. And this was actually made for the Tsunami imprint, so this was made for American comics. But it's been reprinted and is available now from Viz. So I think it's interesting that even though these are a lot of Marvel comics, you'll notice they're available from Viz because they're manga. So that's an interesting evolution on that front. Keeping on along X-Men lines, but also going into some of the other Marvel characters. There's a series, Demon Days. It's got 2 volumes right now by Peach Momoko. Momoko's an interesting artist because she started out doing a whole lot of stuff in Japan, but now she's signed with Marvel exclusively, so she's just a Marvel person at this point. And these are all Japanese versions of the Marvel characters, so it's kind of set in samurai fantasy times, where you have monstrous versions of the characters that you would know from mythology tied in with different Marvel characters, and it's really cool. Great artwork, good translation from Zach Davison. So I would recommend checking out Demon Days. Each issue is kind of set in a different part of the storyline, but the second trade paperback is basically the Demon Days version of the Civil War storyline. So of course, Spider-Man shows up. So if you've been counting, we're up to 14 Spider-Mans so far. There was a quartet of Marvel anime made by Madhouse. If you watched G4 back in the early 2010s, you might have seen these. These were written by Toshiki Inoue from, he wrote Death Note, Kenta Fukusaku, director of Battle Royale, and storyboards by Yoshiaki Kawajiri. So I just got a message that I guess we are running short on time. So we can, 5 minutes, okay. Well, we have a lot to go through. I will skip to the good stuff then. Shonen Jump collaborations, this was a neat thing. This is from Kazuki Takahashi, creator of Yu-Gi-Oh! And this is about Spider-Man and Tony Stark going to Japan and fighting an evil card game mogul. Who would have thought that the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh! Would do that? Deadpool Samurai, this is also available in English. It is fantastic. Deadpool goes to Japan. He puts together a superhero team. My favorite character is Spider Sakura, whose name is Haruka Hida. So if you think about Hida Haruka, like that's her whole shtick is that it's various Spider-Man jokes. Also, All Might shows up to help him out at one point. All right. Guardians, Doctor Strange, Marvel Zombies, there was a version that was done in Japan. Disc Wars, this is my favorite thing. This is basically, they have the technology to capture supervillains in little tiny discs like Pokeballs. And then, of course, that goes wrong and all the superheroes get sucked into discs. And then, of course, Japanese children have to use the discs that have the superheroes inside of them to capture the villains. And the show is amazing. And somebody please license it because it's so good. This one is available on Disney Plus and in English dub. This is also a lot of fun, not quite as fun as the previous one. Capcom games, if you've ever seen Magneto go, I am Magneto, Master of Magnets, and thought this is weird English, that's because it's made in Japan. They did a whole bunch of cool games there. We got figures. We got more figures. We got more figures. We got cats. A lot of Marvel people they brought in a bunch of manga people over the years to do stuff over there. First, they started with Epic Illustrated in 1982. Shinobu Kaze and Go Nagai contributed to this magazine. It's really cool, especially given the time that it came out. Akira, the classic manga, that was first published by Marvel, believe it or not. They colorized it and flipped it and put it in individual issues. Psychonauts is good stuff. They worked with Toei Animation on a whole bunch of projects that were really cool. Also, one of them was Spider-Man, so we got another Spider-Man in there. And all sorts of other artists have worked at Marvel and from Japanese stuff. Kiya Asamiya is at this very convention. You should go pester him about his Marvel stuff. He just had said at his panel today he wants to do some more. Lots and lots of different people. If you go through the time of it. And these people actually work more at Marvel than they do in Japan. But of course, the greatest manga and anime creator in all of Japan is Stan Lee. He's worked on several things that have been made basically for the Japanese market. He has cameos in all of them. So on that note, let's wrap it up.